One of the things that I most love about reading is being able to share a story with somebody else. You know, just being able to talk about what was it that we both loved about a story? What was it that we didn't like about a story? How did we read the story differently? Because we both bring our own experiences to the table. It's so interesting to me how somebody could read the same thing that I read and yet they get something totally different out of it because they have a totally different experience than I do. And now that I have, a little bit of an audience, maybe 10 people watch this YouTube channel consistently, I thought it would be fun to give you my list of my favorite books of all time. I couldn't pick 10, it was too hard. I only picked 13, but I thought it would be fun just to engage with whatever audience I do have and to talk about, what is great about these books. Or maybe, what do you hate about a book that I love? I just find that so interesting and what I love about reading. So I'm gonna give you my 13 favorite books of all time. It was really hard to pick these books. I'm sure if I did this video tomorrow, it'd probably be slightly different. And I can't even imagine what it would be a year from now. Maybe I should redo it in another year if I still have this YouTube channel and see what happens. But let's start out with this easy one, and that is The Lord of the Rings. I absolutely adore The Lord of the Rings, and I say this as somebody who doesn't like fantasy. And the reason that I don't like fantasy, and I think it has more to do with me than the actual genre, I feel like my brain, it just can't wrap around the idea of, these things that aren't real, these characters that aren't real. I can't get into it. However, I feel that Tolkien, he created a world that was real. To me, Middle Earth was real. And I remember the first time that I ever read this book, my dad actually read it to me. And to me, at the end, the ending was so bittersweet and so perfect. I just remember literally screaming to my dad being like, but it's real, Dad, right? Middle Earth is real. And he was like, yes, it is, don't worry. But since that time, I've read this book several times. I actually am reading it to my kids right now. They are almost 10 and almost 12, so they're kind of at the perfect age to do it. At least my daughter is. She's the older one. I think my son's maybe just a little bit too young, but he's chugging along with us. But yes, The Lord of the Rings will forever and always be one of my favorite books of all time. Now, if you have any familiarity with my channel, you're probably gonna know that I'm gonna put The Pillars of the Earth on here. This is a historical fiction novel, and I've decided recently that I am going to either listen to or reread this book once a year. I actually re-listened to it last year, so this year I'm going to reread it. And I know the premise of it sounds pretty boring. It's basically, it takes place in the 1100s in England, and it's about a cast of characters and what is happening around a particular cathedral and the building of the cathedral and how all of these characters, how their lives intertwine. But it is so much more than that. It is just this propulsive page-turner of a novel about so many different characters you're going to love, characters you're going to despise. It's got one of the greatest love stories that I've ever read in literature. It's just so good, and it will forever and always be, like The Lord of the Rings, one of my favorite books of all time. And another thing that I love about it is just how brilliantly all these stories, all these different storylines tie together at the end. Perfect. Next up is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Now, I love this novel because it is a chilling and atmospheric novel, and you really don't know what's happening until the end, and then just the reveal at the end was so clever. But basically it is about an unnamed narrator who gets married to a widower. He's a lot older than her. His name is Maxim de Winter. And when she goes and lives with him at his estate, Manderley, she basically is overshadowed by his earlier wife, by his wife who has passed away, Rebecca. Hence the name of the novel. But as you may see, in terms of why I love certain books, I just love books that are propulsive but also very well written. I think this is, the epitome of literary fiction. It's just so good, and if you've never read it, it's time that you read it. Next up is Middlemarch by George Eliot. So this is a book that I actually only recently read, and it was so good and so surprising to me how much I loved this book that I had to just push it up onto my favorites of all time. I actually listened to this book, and then I felt like I had to buy a copy of it on Thrift Books. I think I spent $6. Yeah, I think I went $6 on this one, but it was well worth the $6. Now, what surprised me about this book and why I loved it so much is because of the suspense that was created towards the end of the novel. I couldn't stop listening because I did listen to it, like I said. I recommend the audio by Juliet Stevenson. But ultimately, this book is about a cast of characters during the Reform era in England who are living in this fictional town of Middlemarch and how their lives are intertwined. And you'd think that, oh, this is just a story about, a bunch of people and, little vignettes about their lives. But it's more than that. And towards the end, you realize that, hey, there's a lot of stuff that is happening. There is a lot of tension, and I can't wait to find out what happens. So I actually couldn't stop listening to this book, which was very surprising to me. I will say that the language is quite archaic, and I did have to stop listening a lot of times to look up words, to look up maybe, historical references that I didn't understand. And that is why I probably would recommend the audio, because I do think that Juliet Stevenson, she does a really good job of, with like her tone and stuff, of letting you know what is going on. She does a really good job acting out the script, but it's so good. Such a beautiful book, and I truly can understand now why many people say that this is one of the greatest works of literature ever written in the English language. Another one of my favorite books of all time is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. So we all know what this is about. This is a tale of revenge. It is a tale of the wrongful accusation and imprisonment of Edmond Dantes during the era when Napoleon is being held on the Isle of Elba. A great tale of revenge. A great soap opera as well. There's so many, other side stories that are going on in this novel, because when this novel was written, it was serialized, and I believe Alexander Dumas would get paid by the word. But a great book, and it is worth the, how many pages is this? Over 1,200 pages, but they go by quickly. And unlike Middlemarch, which I think has quite archaic language, I would say that Alexander Dumas, it's pretty easy. The writing is not hard at all. Next up, Bird Song by Sebastian Faulks. Oh, I just love this book so much. One thing that Sebastian Faulks does so well is he creates the world that you are living in. This is a story about World War I, characters who are living during World War I, and he creates this world in such a realistic way that you feel like you're there. Of course, I wasn't there, he wasn't there. He's basing it off of, the research that he's done, but it feels real. It feels like you've stepped into a documentary. This book also has a dual timeline, and the way that he does it, even though you think you know what happened during the World War I period, the way that he sets up these timelines, you start questioning, and you're like, wait, did that happen? Did he survive? Whose kid is that? So you start asking yourself these questions, and then you literally can't stop reading, or at least I couldn't stop reading. I stayed up really late reading this book, which I never do. I need my sleep. But I think I stayed up till 1 a.m., which is very rare for me, because I had to find out what happened in this book. Ultimately, this book is about a soldier. His name is Stephen Raisford. Before World War I, he has an affair with a French woman, and then, that sort of falls apart, and then it's the story of both of these people and the war and the aftermath of what happened between them. So good. Next up is Kindred by Octavia Butler. Now, similar to Birdsong, similar to why I love Birdsong, Octavia Butler, she has a way of creating these worlds where you feel like you're in a movie. You feel like you've stepped inside it. It becomes real. So I would call this novel historical fiction mixed with time travel. I know Octavia Butler, she usually is known more for science fiction, but this one I'd say it's more historical fiction with, some science fiction flavor to it, with specifically time travel flavor to it. So basically, it's a story about a woman in modern day Los Angeles, or I believe maybe like around the 1960s and 1970s, an African-American woman who is pulled back in time, and she is pulled back into antebellum Maryland, and she basically has to ensure that one of her ancestors is going to be born, otherwise she wouldn't exist in the present. But again, it's just one of those novels that pulls you in. You have to find out what happens, you have to keep turning the page, and it feels real. The characters just jump off the page. Next up is The Hunger Games. I know this is the second one. I lost the cover of the first one, the one that says Hunger Games, but we all know what this is about. This was just a sensation, and I understand why. It was just a great book. I've read it probably like 5 or 6 times, but just for me, it was just one of those books that I couldn't put down, and I loved it for so many different reasons. Next up is Open by Andre Agassi, and this was ghost written by J.R. Moringer. So Andre Agassi talks about in the novel how he basically didn't even graduate high school, so he didn't write it himself. Of course, it's his story, and I believe that J.R. Moringer, he chose not to be listed as the ghostwriter because he felt that it was, all of Andre Agassi's story, and he sort of just like put it into words. Well, he put it into words in an absolutely stunningly beautiful way. So that's one of the reasons that I love this book. But also, just looking at the title, Open, I feel like that Andre Agassi was just so open in the book that I just understood this celebrity. I mean, I'm not somebody who usually cares about celebrities. I truly don't care. But I understood this famous person in a way that I don't feel like I've ever understood anyone else who is famous in the media. Because I feel like people are always sort of, putting up a front, trying to show you what they want you to see. And he's just saying, no, this is me. And I felt like I got a really fascinating understanding of how he felt that he was misunderstood by many people and by the media specifically, how they portrayed him in a way that he felt was unfair and that he was misunderstood. But it was just so good. I loved it. And along a similar vein as Open, Open is a memoir, although it does read like narrative nonfiction. I love narrative nonfiction. I love Into Thin Air. I felt like I was wavering between Into Thin Air and In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which is another book I love. But I felt like this book, it sort of represents what I love about narrative nonfiction, or books that are nonfiction. They're true, but they read like novels. And along a similar theme with all these books that I love is that Jon Krakauer, he has a way of putting you where he is. So this is about a disaster in Mount Everest. So he actually went to Mount Everest to climb it, and he went just to climb it for Outside Magazine and sort of like report on what happened. But in the process, one of the most deadly disasters, or at least I believe it was the deadliest disaster at the time, I don't know if anything worse has happened, but the deadliest disaster in Mount Everest happened while he was climbing. He was part of that disaster. And so it's basically just the story of what happened and what went wrong and all the mistakes that people made, and how Jon Krakauer himself, he barely made it out alive. Just a fascinating book, just so real and picturesque. And you could not pay me, you literally could not pay me to go up Mount Everest. I know people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go up Mount Everest. You could not pay me hundreds of thousands of dollars to go up Mount Everest. But I will read about it any day in books like this one. Next up is A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. Now this is a really hard book. It is a book about two women in Soviet-controlled Afghanistan and on into Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. It is about their unlikely friendship, and it is about so much more than that. It is about persevering in terrible times. It's about love. It's about friendship. It's a beautiful book, and similar to all of the books on this list is the characters just come off the page. They are real and alive, and Khaled Hosseini, he just has a way of pulling at your heartstrings. Just, he knows how to get you emotionally involved in his stories. He is a born storyteller, and I just love not only this book, but The Kite Runner as well. Next up is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Now, similar to Middlemarch, this is a book that I actually have read recently. I never read this book in high school like a lot of people. Now, this is an epistolary novel, and it is about very hard topics. So it's about a woman, Celie, who was growing up in the early 1900s in the Deep South. She's an African-American woman. So ultimately, it's about a lot of really hard things, racism, abuse, sexual abuse, poverty. But ultimately, it is also a story about hope and love and God, about what is God. It's about perseverance. And it's just so beautiful, so uplifting. You could read this. This is an epistolary novel. You could read it in a day. I wouldn't recommend doing that because it is really hard. It's got some really hard themes in it. I would get to about, 70 pages and then I'd, go find something else. But ultimately, it's just so full of hope, and that's why I love this book. And lastly, I had to end with All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. Now, this is a thinly disguised memoir. It is a historical fiction novel about a German soldier during World War I, but it is largely based off of Erich Remarque's experiences as a soldier during World War I, a German soldier during World War I. World War I is a fascinating era of history to me, and the reason why I love this book over all of the other World War I books that I've read is I feel like it most adeptly describes the ethos of that time period. And if I'm thinking about how to describe that ethos, so Sebastian Faulks, I don't know where Birdsong is right now, but he has a quote about World War I, and he says, "An unthinking allegiance to a national cause seemed to have been the motive that led 10 million men to die." So I think why I love this book, and it's a grim book, but it's also a reminder to question authority, to question what the government is telling you, to question what the newspapers are telling you, to warn you about this unthinking allegiance to, a national cause that you are supposed to be following. But that's why I love this book. So there you go. Those are my favorite books. As I was mentioning in the beginning, I would love to hear if you've read any of these books, if you love any of these books, if you hate any of these books. That's what's so fun about reading is, you have this shared experience, and you can talk about, a book that you've both read and how it was different to each other. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, happy reading.